They say he was a man of integrity.
Completely. Absolutely. John, I guess all of you have the story, but the amazing thing to me was the story that he told me one time. He went back to school east, and his father was the founder of O'Melveny and Myers, the famous law firm here in town. And he went back and got his degree, and he had a little Fairchild 24, I believe. He flew it home, and he went in and says they needed an entertainment section at the law firm, and his father didn't disagree. I think I don't remember the story exactly, but anyway, he worked there about a year and walked into his father's office one day and said, "Dad, I don't want to be a lawyer. I want to fly airplanes." And I think 4 or 5 years later, he was chief test pilot for Northrop and Lockheed during the war, so I'm told. So
he loved aviation.
Oh, he loved aviation, and to hear him and Chuck Yeager and Bob Hoover, all of them tell the stories before all of the sophistication as far as the test pilot's concerned. They wrote the book. They're the ones that took the big gamble out of it. And we lost a lot of them, but those guys, I'm very lucky to have lived to get to know those people and get to hear the stories from their mouth, because very few people have been able to do that, to hear it from those guys. And John was, they used to call him the pilot's pilot. And what I loved about John, I never heard him toot his horn about anything. It's always the wonderful stories told by other people about John. And he was always a humble person, never bragged about anything, but all the accomplishments that happened in aviation. For instance, he and Lindbergh, he told me a story one time, he and Lindbergh were the only civilians that ever flew in combat during World War II, and they were both in the South Pacific, and I think Lindbergh figured out some way that the P-38s couldn't fly long distances. Lindbergh figured that out, so they could escort the fighters and bombers. And John was a chief test pilot on the P-61 night fighter, and he went down there, and there was a fella that had 35 victories, the more victories than anybody down there, and he and John went up and went at it. This guy, and whatever he was flying, a P-47, I think, or something. And John shot him down just time after time while they were playing around. So he earned the pilot's pilot. He earned that nickname.
Clay Lacy was talking about those first flight type of pilots to get on the first time a plane's flown. It takes a little courage to be the first flight guy. Huh?
Yeah, but I guess John did a lot of them. I don't know whether it's first in the P-38 and so forth, but I'm told that he was first to fly the P-61. And one time I was in the Air Force in Randolph Field, Texas, in July something of 1941. And I drove the crash truck. I was just 18 years old. So I got in the fire department. I became a fireman. So naturally, I wanted to drive the fire truck. I started driving the fire truck so I wouldn't have to wash those hoses off after a fire. And I was sitting on the flight line one afternoon, and it came over our radio and says, "Go to runway 36 and follow experimental aircraft to the terminal." And I went down there, and here came a flying wing, the first flying wing, and I followed that thing down the runway, and it pulled up, and this tall, skinny guy got out of it, and I thought, boy, that's what I'd like to do someday. And it was John Myers that I didn't meet till 40 years later. It was John Myers taking the first one to Washington, D.C. for John Northrop. And he and I talked about that, and he used to tell me about the excitement that went on that flight across country in the first flying wing. And John lived long enough after all that fiasco over the B-36 and the flying wing and the politics that were a disgrace over that thing, over the cancellation of the flying wing, and then for the B-2 to be built and John to live to fly in that. That must have been a terribly exciting time for John to be able to span that 50 years of flight of the flying wing.
Northrop sent us a lot of old footage of John flying, and it seems like he's always smiling when he's flying.
I've never seen a picture of John flying, but I know that he loved to fly, and every once in a while his wonderful stories of something happening, something that you certainly wouldn't want to have to live through, and he lived through several of those escapades, you know, as a test pilot.
In later years, he flew helicopters too.
Well, I'm told that one time his birthday was coming up, and somebody asked his wife, says, Wonder what John wants for his birthday. He says, he doesn't know it, but I bought him a helicopter. And I think he flew that till way after he was 90 years old. So the guys on the ranch used to tell me that he'd go out and herd cattle with it.
So you spent some time with him up at the ranch?
I was up the ranch twice, at his ranch twice. Most of our ranching visitations were to Baron Hilton's ranch. Baron is a wonderful host, and that's kind of the center of the old aviation people of the world. The glider pilots from Germany, the Clay Lacy, Bob Hoover, all the people that formed the basis of experimental aviation as we know it in this country.
I've been told by a few people we've interviewed this week that John Myers was a handshake type of guy.
Yeah, nobody ever questioned John's integrity. Nobody ever questioned his word. Everybody that knew John knew that his word was his bond, and that's never been questioned by anyone that I know. Shouldn't be, in my opinion. There's a lot of people that knew John better than I did, but we got to spend a lot of weekends with him. One Christmas I remember we said, John, if you don't have any place to go for Christmas, come to our house. And we got to have Christmas dinner, Cleo, John, and I. I think Cleo, wasn't it just us three?
And Simone.
Oh, Simone was here, huh?
She was questioning him.
Yeah.
A lot.
And he liked his dog, Gus.
Oh, Gus. Gus, he loved Gus. Gus went everywhere with him. Gus went on his airplane with him. Gus was inseparable from him, for John. What was that last dog that he had, Cleo? What was its name?
Oh gosh, I can't remember.
Ichabod.
Ichabod, yeah, Ichabod, that's right.
But Gus was the
Yeah.
favorite.
Ichabod was never a Gus, though.
Gus likes to fly, huh?
Yeah. He took him with him everywhere when he flew it for you. On his jet.
I heard that John Myers was a good listener just to other people, and he cared about people.
Well, you'd sit around with Chuck Yeager and Bob Hoover, and sometimes a conversation going for an hour, and John wouldn't do anything except sit there and listen, and he'd probably done anything that any of those guys had done. Of course, I mean, Clay's got more time than anybody in the world, and they just did a book on Clay, and I remember yesterday I happened to think the lady is doing the book. I said, I'd like to add a little bit to that story if you would. I've been thinking about it a little, and she says, fine. And I said, if I were in an impossible situation in an airplane, the one person I'd want next to me would be Clay Lacy. And if it had been in the younger years, it'd have been John Myers.